Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning.
So, Sarah Alami, we are here at the UM6B campus in Rabat. Thank you so much for agreeing to do the interview with us.
My pleasure.
So, you are a researcher at UM6B's School of Collective Intelligence. You're an anthropologist with an MA and a PhD from the University of UC Santa Barbara. And you conduct field work with economically transitioning populations in Morocco and Bolivia. So, to start, could you provide our listeners with an overview of your background and what initially sparked your interest in anthropology?
All right, so thank you so much for interviewing me. So I grew up in Morocco. As a kid, I really loved biology and I loved history. These were my favorite things to study at school, to read books about, and I was also fascinated by animals. I was fascinated by people and fascinated by big questions, so things we don't necessarily think about because they're part of our life, but they're really worth questioning, like questions like, why do we get married? Why do we die? Why do parents love their children? And so I was especially, I think, fascinated by cultural diversity and variation in social institutions. So social institutions that are both universal, so things like family and marriage, but that take very different shape from one society to another. So why is it that in some population, men may marry multiple women and live with their extended family, whereas in others, the nuclear family and monogamy are the norm? And growing up in Morocco and having the opportunity to interact with people from different generations, for example, I was fascinated by how quickly those things can change. So I knew, for example, that my life was going to be completely different from that of my grandmother, and even from that of my mother, and I was fascinated by how quickly those changes in social norms and family structure and things like that can happen. I found that very intriguing and puzzling. And after I graduated from high school, I was quite young. I didn't know what was out there and what opportunities I actually had. So I studied business, probably because it seemed to be a safe choice. My father thought it was a great idea, so I did that for a bit. And then I realized that I didn't necessarily want to have a job. I wanted to continue studying, and by happenstance I was able to go to the United States and start over my studies. And so I did my undergraduate in the United States as well. And there you do have your major, which at the time was still business, but you could take all of these other classes in other disciplines. And so I did, and I took a lot of classes in so many different disciplines like environmental sciences, biology, and there was this class in particular that really changed my life. So I took this class on the evolution of cooperation with Michael Gervin, who would then become my PhD advisor. And it was a class on what does cooperation look like in other animals? Have humans evolved to be a cooperative species? In what kind of environments have our brains evolved? And it was very, very interdisciplinary in nature. So we had readings from biologists, from evolutionary biologists, economists, people who study animal behavior, and also a lot of readings from ethnographers, so a lot of readings, and I was very much exposed to the ethnographic record and read a lot about small-scale populations that still lived in a very traditional way that is more representative of the way our ancestors lived. So if we think of humans have been on this planet for about 300,000 years. And for much of this time, really hundreds of thousands of years, they've lived as hunter-gatherers in small-scale societies. And it's not until about 10 to 12,000 years ago that innovations like agriculture showed up, and that we adopted things. Some places adopted things like agriculture, And if we think of our societies, our industrialized societies, it really is like the blink of an eye. It's really not that long ago. And so our brains and our institutions, the way we think about the world really was very much shaped by those hundreds of thousands of years living as hunter-gatherers. And I was really, really fascinated by these populations. So populations like the Kungsan of the Kalahari Desert, the Yanomamo, the Tsimané in Bolivia. And of course, it's important to not think of these populations as relics of the past, nor should we romanticize them and think of them as always in sync with nature and things like that. Life is hard there, and they do try to control nature to the extent that they can. The instructor in this course, Michael Gervin, he did fieldwork in Bolivia, and he worked with this population called the Tsimané. They still gather. They do some small scale. They do small scale agriculture. But they're a subsistence population, meaning that over 99% of their food comes from what they produce themselves, and they're very independent from the market and so on. Although that's changing rapidly. And like a lot of Moroccans, I was fairly good at picking up languages, and so I could speak Spanish. And at the end of the class, after I presented my final project, the professor was quite happy with it, and we had a little chat. And then after he learned that I could speak Spanish, he was like, well, would you like to go to the field and see what it's like? And of course, I thought that was an amazing opportunity, and that's how it all started. So that's how not only did I discover anthropology, but that's also how I discovered fieldwork and how I discovered my interest in research. And for the first time, I realized that I could actually become a researcher, and that's something that was within reach.
Right. So yeah, your research took you to Bolivia, and so in these regions, can you tell us a little bit about this field work over there and your findings? And I think that was what brought you to your PhD thesis, was on field work with those populations. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Right. So it was a long journey. I worked on many different things. So I started working. So with my PhD advisor, who has this biomedical project, they're very interested in understanding the process of aging and senescence in general, from many different points of view. From a health perspective, so what happens in the body. From a social perspective, what do you do as an older person? Why is it that humans have a very long lifespan after menopause or after they stop reproducing? They don't just drop dead like other species, and they're quite important for society. So what do they do? Why are they so important for our social fabric? And that's how I started. I started working on these kinds of questions as part of a very broad collaborative project. And so what we did at the time, so my first time in the field, we were collecting data on artery calcification, so heart disease. And there was this idea that heart disease is it was very popular in the literature, that heart disease is a new disease. It's a disease of civilization that didn't exist before, and the reason why we have diseases like heart disease, diabetes, etc. is just that people now live longer, and in the past people did not live that long. They just died of infections before, and so they never had the opportunity to develop chronic diseases of aging. And that was kind of contradicted by some new findings, so findings of mummies that had artery calcifications, for example. And there's a team of medical doctors who were working with these mummies that were really interested in looking at the hearts of populations that still had a very traditional lifestyle. And so that's how they ended up working with my PhD advisor. And what we did is scan the hearts of a lot of elderly Tsimané people, and these are not my personal findings, they are the findings of a very wide research project led by my PhD advisor and other colleagues, notably Hilly Kaplan at Chapman University, was that, well, first, these people live long lives. people in the past probably lived long lives too. We think that people had short and brutish lives because of our misconceptions, but also because infant mortality is very high. And so when you look at just averages, it's true, the average lifespan may be 50 years old in these populations, or 60 years old at most, but once you've survived past age 15, or even past age 5, you have a pretty good shot at living a fairly long life until your 70s, your 80s. And but what was surprising is that we didn't find any artery classification. So these were very old people that were scanned, they're in their 80s, sometimes in their 90s, 70s, etc. And they had very young, healthy hearts. And of course, that prompted a lot of follow-up questions. So why is that? Is it diet? Is it exercise? Is it the fact that their immune system develops differently? They're exposed to a lot of different things, and so they react to inflammation differently. So a lot of very cool and different hypotheses. So that was the first project I worked on. At the same time, I was also very much interested in the sexual division of labor and in cooperation in general, and that's part of it. So why is it that the sexual division of labor is so common in the ethnographic record? You see it in a lot of different populations. Is there anything that we should learn about it to understand why women are underrepresented in positions of power, for example, today in our industrialized societies? And also, how come there's still quite a lot of variation in the status of women across populations? And it was interesting to work with the Tsimané, because being there, you realize that they're very, very egalitarian societies. They don't really have a leader. There is a person called the corregidor who's there mostly as an intermediary between people and outsiders more than anything else. Conflicts are managed by influential people, and influence comes from just charisma and expertise rather than, it's not inherited. And within that context, I was sort of really interested in what it was like to be sort of a woman in these societies, and to what extent they had a say in community decisions. And so that was a new research interest that emerged. And I collaborated with Chris van Bruden, who's at Richmond University now, and comparing the political influence of men and women. And what we found there was that women did have less political influence than men, but it was only the case because so once you adjust for certain things, like how many children they have and how and certain physical characteristics such as size, and it all drops out. So it's not necessarily being a woman per se that makes you less influential. It's all of these other things that matter. And at the time as well, there was a lot of, in the literature, there was a lot of so people interested in this topic in the econ literature in particular have published a lot of studies looking at competitiveness in men and women, and it was always the same thing over and over again. Men are more competitive, men are more out there, they're more willing to take risks, and women are not so competitive. And the justification for that, whether it's from economists or sometimes from even biologists, was, okay, well, women are more risk averse because they're the primary carer for children. They have to carry these children in their bodies, so they have to be careful, they have to avoid physical harm, and so we're just wired to be less competitive. And it's not just about constraints, it's also motivations. Because we're wired that way, we might be less, as women, motivated to pursue positions of leadership. And that just didn't sit well with me because I was doing a PhD and I just felt like trying to survive in this really competitive environment, and it just didn't really make sense. And so I started thinking about, okay, well, so the other explanation was that for men, when you're competitive, you have really high rewards in terms of fertility in traditional populations. So very highly influential men in hunter-gatherer societies tend to have a little more children. In societies that are more stratified, where there's a lot more inequality, they have they can have many, many more children. Think of people like Genghis Khan or the King Moulay Ismail, the Sultan Moulay Ismail, who have like hundreds of children, whereas women's fertility is limited, and even if you had all of the resources available to you and all you did was reproduce, you could only, have so many because of the demands of pregnancy and lactation and whatnot. And so that was that's biological justification. But then I started thinking about, okay, well, if that's how men reap the rewards of competitiveness, at least in traditional societies, is through fertility gains, well, what's in it for women? Women are certainly competitive. I mean, there is indication that they also engage in competition. Maybe they compete differently, but certainly there is, it's not a concept that isn't familiar to them, or a feeling that is unfamiliar to them. And so what do they gain out of it? And so this is where I started thinking, rather than looking at like the number of children they produce, maybe, what about, and it's weird to talk about children like that, but the quality of these children. So do they have healthier children? Are their children more likely to survive? So that's in a small-scale society context, and in a more industrialized context. So what about the educational achievements of these children? And so that's what led me to conduct that second study on sort of gender aspects among the Tsimané, looking at women's political influence and what effect that might have on their children's health. And we indeed found that these influential women, they indeed had children who were less likely to get sick, less likely to be diagnosed with common illnesses, and also were less likely to be stunted in terms of growth. So we had some data on their anthropometrics. And that mirrored very much some new studies that were coming out in the eco-literature about how, so when you do, this is at the individual level, so these influential women have themselves these healthier kids. But if you look at it at a more societal level, it sort of mirrored these other results that found that when you increase, for example, quotas for women to be represented in parliament, for example in India, then you see improvements in neonatal mortality. So neonatal mortality drops a little bit, and that's because women do invest in things like healthcare. They do genuinely care about these topics, so they're more likely to put effort into improving these kind of things like child health and so on. And likewise, there was this paper looking at how the fact that women had the right to vote in the US had helped the United States take advantage of advances of modern medicine to eradicate certain infectious diseases. So that mirrored that quite well. So that was another research interest that came from spending time in the field and thinking about all of these questions. And very often, that's what usually happens. You are in the field, you're working on something, and then things happen around you, and then you start asking yourself questions, and that's how I always have generated research questions. So for my PhD thesis, I was very much intrigued by the fact that the Tsimané were different from this other population to which they were related to, but that looked a lot more, they were more organized, and they were able to get more things from the government, even if they were a smaller population. So the Tsimané are 16,000, maybe more people, but they're not as well represented in the government, in the Bolivian government, as this other population, the Mosetan, that they're a related population. They come from the same original population, which is much smaller, but have much better representation. They're less poor. They have more access to governmental help. They have more access to a whole lot of things. They speak Spanish, all of them. Education is higher. Life is easier. So how come these two populations were very different? And part of it, certainly, and that's something my colleague Ed Seabright is interested in, has to do with their history. The Tsimané were contacted much later by evangelical missionaries, the New Tribes Mission in the 70s, whereas the Mosetan were forcibly settled by Catholic priests, Catholic missionaries, Franciscans, etc., in the 18th, 19th century. So much longer, and they had, as a result, the Catholics had established these missions with this hierarchical organization that meant that they were more internally able to do certain things, like get help from the government and whatnot. But another aspect was, so the Tsimané are very remote. They're in the Bolivian Amazon, and to get there it takes a really long time. Now the roads are better, but it still takes a long time to reach their territory. They basically, when the Catholics arrived, they just escaped in the forest.
So they're not originally from that place. They moved.
They moved, yeah. They were from the area. They didn't move very far, but they did go deeper in the forest in a way that no one could find them before the 70s. And whereas the Mossetén, they're in between. So if you think of Bolivia, there's the highlands and there's the lowlands, the mountains, and then the Amazon. And the Mossetén are in between, are in this region we call the Alto Beni. And in the Andes, you have all of these other people, so people who have Incan origins and the Maya and all of this older civilization, so the Aymara and the Quechua, that have this ties to this older, more established civilization that in the 50s onwards, started migrating to the Alto Beni because of overpopulation, because of some government incentives and some things that were going on, like mines shutting off. And as they moved, they started living with the Mossetén, who had this more Amazonian lifestyle, and they brought with them certain cultural norms and certain social norms. So for example, they have a very different way of doing agriculture. They do agriculture more intensively because in the Andes you only have access to little land, and there's only so much you can do in a terrain like that. And the fact that they intermarried had basically kind of completely changed their culture. They were this really interesting in-between. They weren't like the Tsimané. They weren't necessarily like the Andean people. They were still there, very much their own population, but they had been very much influenced by that. And so I became really interested by intermarriage and what effect that has on all sorts of things. So first of all, why would you do something like that? Because it seems very costly. It's costly to marry someone from a different culture. It's well documented. There's high risk of divorce. There's a lot of problems of communication, different cultural differences. But does it happen just because you can? No, there's people around and you just do it because they're available, or are you incentivized to do it because it provides access to certain things? And that was my PhD thesis, and what I found is that very often there was some kind of exchange. So Mossetén women really wanted to marry those Andean men because they were seen as more successful. They knew how to get ahead in life. That's something that they kept repeating. And at the same time, this Aymara and Quechua men really wanted to marry Mossetén women because you could become part of the Mossetén community, and when that happens, you have access to communal land. You don't necessarily own it, but you can exploit it, and it's only a small fee compared to what it would take for you to actually buy land. And so they had this interest, this mutual interest. That's not to say that love doesn't exist or anything like that, but marriage was nonetheless, intermarriage was somewhat motivated by these kind of things. And it had some important consequences on how people viewed themselves. So the Mossetén, for instance, were much more likely to view themselves as part of, people who were intermarried, even among the Mossetén, were more likely to view themselves as part of the bigger Bolivian society. They had national identity, whereas those who weren't intermarried, or the children from intermarried couples, they were less likely to think of themselves as Bolivians and much more likely to think of themselves as Mossetén, although everybody thought of themselves as Mossetén, but it was just these other ones where, in addition to thinking of themselves as Mossetén, they also thought of themselves as part of this bigger thing, whether it was Bolivia or Latin America or these higher identities were more important to them. What I did in grad school, these are the kind of things I worked on. Of course, lots of collaborations. During COVID, we were really worried about what would happen to the Tsimané and the Mossetén. As you know, indigenous populations in the Americas have been decimated by epidemics that people from other parts of the world brought. So that was no different at the time, and we were really scared about what would happen. And so we really tried to be proactive about it, and we had all of this data on social structure, on how often people travel to different villages, on we had this time allocation data, which are basically this incredible, very, very rich data set where we had anthropologists follow people for a certain amount of time and like record what they did. And so we knew for every point in time where this person was, what they were doing, who they were interacting with, in addition to how often they traveled to town and how far their houses were from the houses of their neighbors and so on. And because we had that rich data set, what we did was try to model the spread of COVID in these communities. So very often when you have this attempt to model the spread of viruses like COVID, they're very naive when it comes to the structure of the populations where you do that. You make big assumptions. You assume that everybody in your network has the same probability of transmitting diseases to each other, because I'm as likely to interact with you as I am with Reda, and vice versa. But in reality, that's not the case. They might work in a big population, in a big city, that works fine. But in these small-scale populations, actually, that this assumption about homogeneity is not accurate. And so we did have all of the data to be able to build a model using all of the information we had about people's networks to make predictions about the spread of COVID. And yeah, no, predictions were pretty accurate. Now, was that very useful for people on the ground? Maybe not, but in general, we were very lucky because people were quite, they all got COVID, everybody got COVID, but thankfully the death toll was very low, and that's very likely because they have very healthy lungs, very healthy hearts, and so they weren't really affected by it. And it's a fairly young population. There were only very, very few deaths, and yeah, but it was a very interesting exercise. And for the first time, we realized that we could use this anthropological data to do things like epidemiological modeling, and that it was not only was it interesting from a medical perspective, so we could predict the spread of disease, but it was also interesting from a cultural perspective. You could use that to model the spread of ideas and other things like that.
What strikes me when describing your research, fieldwork, and anthropology is the really the interdisciplinary aspect of what you're doing. And can you tell us a bit more how do you navigate between all these different fields? There's anthropology, economy, you talked about epidemiology. How do you navigate these different aspects of your work, and tell us a bit more how it has influenced your research, but also your teaching, because you also teach, whether it's at UC Santa Barbara, but also here at CI.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think interdisciplinarity becomes natural at some point in your academic development. I don't think I'm the only one in this position. I think a lot of researchers, they start within a discipline and then very quickly realize that they have to borrow either methods or theory from other disciplines. And I think anthropologists anthropologists in particular are kind of jack of all trades. So I remember even in my training, I took a lot of courses in the econ department. I took immunology core classes, and that was really great. So I think it became very quickly very natural. And another thing that happens when you're in the field, so you have to do a lot of things with what you can. So for instance, we had to collect health data, but without electricity, and how do you make that happen, and how do you so very often you become quite inventive and quite creative. So there's a lot of things that I learned on the ground, even lab work. I didn't learn that in an actual lab. I learned that in the field, in a made up lab in the field, and it just became quickly very natural. we rely on a lot of techniques that we borrow from other disciplines. So information theory is very important. We use that a lot when we think about statistics and how to compare models. I'm very interested in how people interact with each other, and so social network analysis is very important to me, and that's a method that I use all the time. So basically, I have questions that I want to answer, and then I don't care where the methods I'm using are coming from, so long as they help me answer the question that I have. Also, theoretically, it's quite important to have a interdisciplinary sort of grounding, because for me in particular, evolutionary theory was really important. Nothing makes sense except in the light of evolutionary theory or evolution, and having an evolutionary perspective to think of a whole bunch of problematics, whether we're talking here about health issues. So why is it that people develop a fever? What do these diseases mean? Do they have a function? Thinking about questions in interdisciplinary ways is really important. Or whether it's social issues. So a researcher that has really influenced me is Tim Bergen. So he was an ethologist, so studied animal behavior, and his way of answering the question was always to be like, okay, think about this if you want to understand the behavior in an animal, I mean humans are animals, so they're included in that, any behavior or any particular trait, you have to ask yourself these 4 questions. So first of all, you have to understand it mechanistically. So what happens? What exactly happens? So for example, if we're thinking about a fever, what is it? What's a fever? So the temperature goes up, and what's the physiological, what happens physiologically in your body? And then the second one is ontology. So when do you start developing fever? So it's development. So when you're born, does it happen if you're a fetus? Does it happen only after a certain age? And that sort of helps you understand when in your lifespan this thing becomes important. The third one is phylogeny. So compared to other species, is this new or was this already there? Do other species also have fevers? What is the first species to have had a fever? Because if it's new and if it's only your species, that's interesting and that says something about your species. If it's shared with other species that you're closely related to, so maybe you inherited it from a common ancestor. If it's shared with a species that you're not related to, and that's very far in the relatedness tree, then it suggests that there's something shared in your environments that was a strong selection pressure for you to end up with this same thing, even though you're not related to each other, and that's also interesting. So that's phylogeny. And when you have these 3, when you've answered these 3 questions, it's like doing a puzzle, and you're able to answer the final, last, ultimate question: why did this thing evolve? Why is it here? So, for example, in the case of fever, which is a very easy example, it's the way that your body has to kill stuff that's not good for you, and maybe you should let it happen. Maybe, well, of course, in certain cases, you should take medicine if you're a small child and it goes over a certain temperature, etc. But maybe it's not a bad thing. Maybe it's just the way your body has to defend itself. And same thing for behavior. You can do that with anything. You can do that with for example, one thing that is quite fascinating to me is that human fathers, they usually care about their children. They love their children. They take care of them. Sometimes they're not here, they're absent, but they're often around. At least they're more around than a bull would be for his baby, or than a cat. And never seen a father cat care for their kid, and so and that's interesting. And so you could ask that as well. So mechanistically, how does it work? What do fathers exactly do? Do they do more active care? Are they more like providers? You can think about development. Do they always care about their babies, or are there specific periods in time where they care about their babies? What about cross-culturally? You can think about phylogeny. Are there any other species where you see this behavior happen? Well, in mammals, not so much, not really, but you do see it in birds. Birds are great. In a lot of species, they do take care of their babies, and then thanks to all of this, you're like, well, why? Why is it that you see this, but only in birds and humans really, and then you realize, well, maybe because baby birds, like baby humans, are very altricial, so they're very underdeveloped. They're quite useless when they're born. They don't know how to hold their head, and they need to be fed. They need constant attention, and that's the way we are able to reproduce and produce. I mean, especially in the case of humans, they are altricial because we are bipedal, and our women's birth canal is very narrow, and so you can't really birth a very big baby with a big brain, but at the same time we need a big brain because we're a very social and cooperative species, so we have this dilemma of having to birth giant brains through a very narrow birth canal. And the solution, nature has found is to make babies come earlier than they would had we had a wider birth canal, and as a result these babies require so much care and so much help, and that's why fathers are involved, but also why other people in your society are involved, not just fathers. That's why
so the cooperation of the whole of the family, of the
Exactly.
wider community. So maybe also coming back to that original question that you had, you mentioned, okay, you were interested in cooperation, you mentioned at the beginning, and is the human species a cooperative species or competitive species? Is it a mix of both? Found answers to that? Are there answers to that?
It's a complex question. It's definitely an extremely cooperative species, but also I think because of the way we've evolved, so we've evolved in these small-scale societies, belonging to a group was very important, and so very often we do have a lot of in-group, out-group dynamics, which also make us very competitive. And it's a bit of a dilemma now because we live in this world that's very connected, and it would be for the best of everybody in this world to just cooperate across cultural divides and all of these other markers that we use to differentiate ourselves from each other, and yet here we are, and we still are very much attached to concepts like nations and countries and identities and whatnot. And of course these are important, and the cultural variation in this thing is wonderful, but it is a weird situation that we found ourselves in. We rely on each other so much at an international level for everything. I mean, like, I'm wearing a dress that fits me, and somebody probably at the other side of the world that I've never met made it, and it fits, and I liked it, and I bought it, and I've never met this person, so it's quite impressive how connected we are. And yet we find it also very natural to think of ourselves as different from others. We define ourselves based on our many identities. So I'm part of the school of collective intelligence, and so they're part of that, and I'm from Rabat and you're from Casablanca. It's ridiculous, but
and of course there are always different levels
exactly.
in that sense, right? Morocco, Africa.
Exactly, and the way we build those identities are very interesting. They come with a lot of good things because that's how we help each other out, and that's how we build our cooperative networks, but they also come with, there's a downside. Sometimes it's very easy, it's very easy for people to be discriminatory towards others, and it comes very naturally to people, and it's an instinct we really need to fight against.
So Sarah, after completing your studies and PhD in the US, you came back, you returned to Morocco. So what motivated your decision to come back and come back to also to work for the School of Collective Intelligence at UM6B?
Right, so three things. The first one was the fact that UM6B was a new and very promising university, and in particular I had learned that they provide scholarships for students, and that students came from very diverse background, and actually economically diverse background, in a way that is talked a lot about abroad in US universities or in Europe, but concretely doesn't really happen. and at least not to this extent, not to the extent that I've seen here. So for example, amongst my students, there are students, I mean, a lot of them, most of them have a scholarship. Most of them are the first ones in the family to pursue their higher education. A lot of them come from quite small villages here and there, and this is the first time they're going to be living in a city like Rabat. And there's so much cultural diversity, so we have a lot of students not only from different regions in Morocco, but also from different countries in Africa. So a lot of students from Nigeria, Ghana, Benin, and that's fantastic. That creates an environment that is in which not only these students are brilliant and motivated, really the diversity makes it so that they are exposed to something different. The way they interact with each other is super interesting, and the ideas they come up with are very innovative and original. And there's an atmosphere here that is very optimistic at UM6P, but in Morocco in general. It feels like the future is bright, life is going to get better for people, and that's a really nice thing to be part of. I would have dreamed to go to a university like this in my own country when I was younger, and I'm just really grateful it exists, and I hope it continues to have this these values and to emphasize the importance of cultural diversity, of socioeconomic diversity, and to continue encouraging students from diverse backgrounds. And that's honestly, teaching has never been so rewarding. This is the place where teaching has been the most rewarding. I love it very, very much. Now, the second reason why I joined UM6P was because I wanted to be back in Morocco, of course, for personal reason. I study how important family is for survival, and it's only natural that I want to be closer to my own family. But also, I always wanted to do fieldwork in Morocco. I had scouted some places when I was a grad student, but it was complicated to do because I didn't have the resources and the time to stay here for long and extended periods of time. And the way I do fieldwork is I want to know and build strong relationship with people. I don't like helicopter research where you show up, you collect your data, you leave, and you never talk to these people again. I really want to have an impact in the long run. I do collect longitudinal data. I think that's very important. And in particular, I was very interested in transitions and how transitioning from a pastoralist lifestyle, especially in the high atlas, to a more settled lifestyle and increasing involvement in wage labor, how that changed the social fabric, how that changed the way people cooperate, and what happens to these traditional networks of support. Do they disappear? Do they carry on? Do people just rely on new ways of dealing with uncertainty, like reliance on banks and so on? Or how does cooperation change, and then how do social norms change? And that's what we're really interested in looking at in the future. And also changes in health, that's also something I would like to pursue. Hopefully hope to collaborate with other researchers, possibly at the new med school, to look at how the transition changes people's health. I don't know if we realize this yet, but in Morocco we are at the verge of a new health crisis. People are going to live longer, they're going to develop new kinds of diseases, and it's really important that we know what's going to happen in the future to be able to best deal with it. I'm thinking specifically here of chronic diseases of aging, so things like heart disease, but also Alzheimer's, dementia, and other diseases that are quite difficult to manage. But I'm also at UM6P. As a researcher, I feel like I have a lot of freedom to be creative, and freedom to think deeply about what it is that I want to pursue in terms of research interests. Because of the way the academic world is structured, the pressure to publish, very often abroad, in order to have a stable job, you need to publish a lot. And publishing a lot is great, quantity is great, but quality is also important, and there's inevitably a trade-off between the two. and it's really nice to have some stability here and to be able to really dedicate time to do things right and to do things well. And to be able to give back also to the people I work with. I mean, I would never be able to do my research without the people I work with, without going to the field. And it's only natural that I contribute to improving, their lives, and that's very important to me, to have long-term projects, or to be able, in the long term, for instance, to provide some healthcare in regions that are lacking healthcare, or access to drinkable water, and so on, things like that, education, etc.
And are there any aspects of the university that you feel are lacking or that could be developed?
So I think it's a new university, and that comes with a lot of challenges, but also with a lot of opportunities. As a young researcher who had her PhD yesterday, I feel like I have a disproportionate amount of influence compared to what that would have been in another university, which is fantastic. But I do think that we certainly, I would like to have more students. I would like the campus to be a more lively place. I think that a lot of our resources could be channeled towards having even more students. I would also like to see more collaborations between researchers across departments, so maybe sort of better communication about what goes on in other departments, so we're able to create collaborations and exchange ideas. I think these are the main things I'm thinking about, and I really, really hope that the university continues to give importance to these values of cultural diversity, and continues to privilege students from underprivileged backgrounds, and continue to provide scholarships. I think that's really important. It feels like there's no other place like this that I know of today, whether it's in Morocco or elsewhere, and it's my main motivation, and what gets me up in the morning when I have to go teaching. It's just so rewarding, and I hope it continues to be that way.
Yeah. And the Chair of Complexities Humanities is organizing an event during the next Science Week in February at the campus in Bengurir. It's going to be the centennial, the Paul Feyerabend centennial, and you'll be participating in the centennial. And in the afternoon, we will be talking about the reconstruction of the Hayatas after the earthquake, and we're going to look at it from the perspective of making sure to take into account the local population's knowledge, culture, and from their perspective, and how they perceive what their needs are and how things should be implemented. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and also based on your field work in Hayatas?
So I do like the Feyerabend connection, of course, when it comes to thinking about the reconstruction in the Hayatas, because as you know, he had this idea that different kinds of knowledge are important, and traditional forms of knowledge are important, and it's really important. These people have been living in a fairly difficult environment for a really long time. They know what they're doing better than an external person does, and so they know what's in their best interests. So I don't personally work in regions that have been affected by the earthquake, so thankfully the villages where I work have been spared. Having said that, they're very similar to the villages that have been affected, and I do have a PhD student who works on reconstruction, Asma Maroufi, with the Global Diversity Fund, and probably has a lot more to say on the topic than I do.
And she'll be participating.
Yeah, she'll be participating, exactly. But I do think, in a way, it's as sad as the earthquake was, and as horrible as it was, and many people have died, lost their belongings, etc. I think it's an opportunity to do better in these regions, and for all of us to sort of be more involved in what's going on in rural Morocco. I do think that rural populations are an important part of the world populations. They're very important. Without them, we would not be eating the food we eat. And they're also, as Feyerabend knew very well, they are the garant of, they have knowledge that we don't, and that's really important to preserve. And diversity is important in all of its form. Biological diversity is important. Without diversity, there's no evolution. There's nothing to select from pure natural selection. And so it's very easy to go extinct when there is no more diversity. And in the same way, cultural diversity is very important, especially for humans. Humans are, by definition, a cultural species. We don't grow hair on our body very much to protect ourselves against the cold. We wear coats and we make clothes, and everything we do is cultural. We survive because we're a cultural species. I would not be able to survive in the Arctic without the knowledge of the Inuit, and an Inuit would not be able to survive in the Sahara Desert without the knowledge of people who live there. And so it's crucial that we value traditional knowledge and that we preserve it and continue to work towards ways in which different kinds of knowledge interact with each other.
Great. Sarah, just to finish off on this conversation, and for students or aspiring anthropologists who might be listening to our podcast, what advice would you offer them based on your own experiences and journey in the field?
I think to be a little adventurous, to believe in themselves. I would have never thought that I'd become a researcher growing up. It seems like something that you'd watch on TV, and it seemed so far away and out of reach, but really it isn't. And now we have a university in our own country where it's possible to do research, which is fantastic. So to think that, to not think that things are impossible and out of reach, that's important. To find support and good people to work with, so a good advisor. People in general in academia are very cooperative, they're friendly, they're really willing to help, and it's important to try and contact people and see if they're interested, and to have a chat with them and to develop your research ideas. And then, for me particularly, if you're interested in anthropology and interested in field work, Morocco and Africa are an amazing place to be, the most diverse continent in the world. And so there are so many opportunities and so many things to do. And it's really important that researchers who are interested in doing field work have some familiarity with the places that they do field work in, because I think that provides perspective, and it's important to have both, in my opinion. And also that you should not be scared of doing field work. It's hard work. It comes with a lot of challenges. I got sick many times when I was in Bolivia. It's not easy, but it's also extremely rewarding. The first time I went to the field, on my way back, we flew over the Amazon, and I was looking over the forest and thinking to myself, it's okay if I die tomorrow. I think I've lived a full life. This is good enough. And be happy with this.
That's something we could all aspire to, is to have that feeling. Okay. Well, thanks again, Sarah, for this conversation.
Thank you.
It's great.